In this video, I'm going to explain the best way for a disabled employee to request a reasonable accommodation at work. I'm going to explain how to do this in a way that not only will it increase the chances your request will be granted, but it will also lay a legal foundation that you'll be able to use if your employer retaliates and fires you. My name is Branigan Robertson, and I'm an employment lawyer. This is part 4 in our 5-part reasonable accommodation video series. In part 1, I told you that the most common reason Americans get fired unlawfully is when the employer is unwilling to reasonably accommodate the worker when he or she becomes disabled. In part 2, I shared the most common reasonable accommodations that employees are granted. In part 3, I exposed all the unlawful ways that HR denies reasonable accommodation requests. Now this video, we're going to cover what is probably the most important subject, which is how to properly request a reasonable accommodation at work. The goal is that you make your request in a way that maximizes the chances that it's granted, but you'll also do it in a way that if the employer decides to break the law and deny your request, you can hold them accountable in a court of law. Now, before I get going, you should know that although I'm a California lawyer, I'm making this video for workers all over America. But this video should not be considered to be legal advice. This is YouTube. If you need legal advice, you should call a lawyer in your state. If you worked in California and you've been fired, you can call my office for a free consultation. I'll put my contact information on the video screen at the end of the video. Number 1, put your request in writing. Now, no matter how many times I tell people that they should put things in writing, it's astonishing to me how few actually do. When you are requesting something as important as a reasonable accommodation, it should be in an email. It should be in writing. And the reason why I like emails is that there's a date and time stamp. Why is this so important? Because if there is a legal dispute down the road, your lawyer is going to want to prove that you requested your accommodation. It's much easier to win these very difficult cases if your lawyer can prove that. And if your lawyer can't prove that, then it becomes your word versus their word. And that opens the door to the company denying that you made a reasonable accommodation request. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a deposition where HR straight up denies that something happened that my client was certain that they would verify. And every good lawyer I know has either lost cases or had to settle for way less than the case was worth simply because their client didn't put key evidence in writing. Beyond this, not only should your request be in writing, but it should also be polite, respectful, and concise. My office reviews hundreds of accommodation requests every year, and we review them every week. And we see them every week where the employee doesn't request, he or she demands an accommodation, while simultaneously accusing the company of doing all sorts of horrible things. Now, even if all those things are true, requesting an accommodation like this is a mistake. Do not bury your request in a 6-page diatribe of grievances. Your request should be short, obvious, and polite. If you have a complaint, that's fine. Put it in a separate email, not in your accommodation request. FYI, I've made several videos on how to properly complain at work, and I recommend that you watch them before you become a keyboard warrior and put the company on blast. Because remember, at the end of the day, it is likely that a jury of your peers is going to be deciding your case. And if your accommodation request portrays you as an entitled brat looking to cash in on the lawsuit lottery, you are going to lose every single time. In your request or in your complaints, you need to sound like a level-headed, loyal employee, not somebody who's trying to weaponize their victimhood. You need to operate in good faith, and the verbiage you use when you put things in writing needs to be congruent with that. So to recap all this, why is this important? When you put things in writing, you're more likely to win and you're more likely to increase the value of your case. Number 2, get a doctor's note. What do you need to provide to your employer in order to request a reasonable accommodation? Well, legally speaking, HR is allowed to request medical verification of your disability and to request that your doctor substantiate the need for the requested accommodation. Okay, well, how do you satisfy that requirement? Easy. Get a doctor's note from a real doctor, real medical provider. Now, this doctor's note can't be just, Bob is disabled, please grant him an accommodation. No. Under the federal guidelines, legally, it must be more specific than that. At a minimum, your doctor's note should do 3 things. Number 1, describe the nature, severity, and duration of your disability. Number 2, describes the activities your disability limits and how much it limits them. And number 3, substantiates why the employee requires a reasonable accommodation. Getting a note like this is especially important when your disability is not something that is immediately obvious. For example, your boss and coworkers cannot see that you've been diagnosed with cancer, epilepsy, or an autoimmune disease. Even if your disability is obvious, say you broke your leg and your doctor put you in a cast and crutches, it's still important to substantiate that with a doctor's note. Unfortunately, we do live in a world where lots of employees lie to their boss to try to get out of doing their work. So it's best practice to prove to the employer that you are being honest regarding your claimed disability. Now, you might be thinking, look, I don't really want to tell my boss about my medical issue. What about my medical privacy? What about HIPAA? I hear you, and we're going to talk about privacy and HIPAA in just a second. Before we do that, though, we need to cover something that is more important. If you're asking for a short leave of absence as an accommodation, it's extremely important that your doctor's note identify an end date to that leave of absence. The employer has no obligation to grant you an open-ended leave of absence. So you, the employee, need to make sure that there is a projected end date written down in that doctor's note. And it needs to be written by the doctor. Obviously, you shouldn't be making up that date. It's very important for you to ensure that your doctor does this right. Look, doctors don't know the employment laws. They have no idea what the case law says regarding reasonable accommodations. Even if they do, they're super busy and they forget stuff all the time, just like everybody does. So when you see a doctor, clearly explain to him or her that when they write the note, it's very important they put a projected end date for the leave of absence. Now, that end date is not set in stone. If you're not able to return to work when that date arrives, you can probably get your date extended a week or a month or longer. But what we want to avoid is an open-ended note. The case law in California is pretty clear about this. An employer can terminate you for saying it's unreasonable for them to hold the job open indefinitely. And in California, they would likely win that argument. Okay, well, what about your medical privacy and HIPAA? Do you have to tell your employer about your diagnosis and other highly sensitive medical information? It's a real concern. A lot of people ask us about this. Before I answer that, you need to understand the tension here. You obviously want your medical information to stay private, right? However, you are also asking your employer to make a change to your job, the accommodation. They are legally allowed to ask you why. And unfortunately, you're just going to have to, trust me, bro, is not going to cut it, as a trust system like that will be heavily abused. Well, in California, We have certain regulations. Employers may not request specific diagnosis information to determine whether an employee is disabled, because doing so invades the California Constitution regarding privacy rights. However, employers are entitled to limited inquiries regarding the employee's functional limitations. Now, personally, I don't think it's wise to give HR the stiff arm when they are making inquiries regarding your health situation. This is especially true when you feel that they are genuinely trying to figure out how to accommodate you and seem to be participating in the interactive process in good faith. However, if you're in one of those uncomfortable employment situations where things are really hostile, or you do not feel like the company is acting in your best interest, and you really want to avoid giving them medical information, I recommend that you ask your doctor to limit the note to only the 3 core elements that we talked about before. And I think the best way to explain how to do this is with an example. Let's pretend that you are an accountant and you were just diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, and your doctor wants you to have surgery to have part of your colon removed, followed by 6 weeks leave of absence, totally off of work, and then when you return, 4 to 6 months of intermittent leave to permit you to go to chemotherapy once a week for 4 hours. Your doctor's note should read something like this: Mr. Smith has been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, which will temporarily interfere with his ability to do the job. Mr. Smith will be undergoing a medical procedure on January 1st, and he will require a 6-week complete leave of absence to heal. He may return to work on February 15th. After his return, Mr. Smith can resume full duties and hours as an accountant. However, he will require 4 to 6 months of intermittent leave where he can take approximately 12 to 16 hours off per month at various times to undergo further treatment to hopefully fully defeat the cancer. This is a serious medical situation, and your compliance with these directives is appreciated. With a note like that, you're not revealing what kind of cancer, you're not revealing that you're having surgery and what the surgery entails, but the note fully conveys the limitations on your jobs and substantiates the reasons for the accommodation. But honestly, in my personal preference, in the real world, I would always err on the side of sharing too much medical information rather than too little, because I understand the consequences of what happens when somebody gets fired and the employer refuses to accommodate them. So err on the side of sharing too much rather than too little. Next, you really need to understand that context matters. You might be asking yourself, okay, Branigan, in the real world, how come some disabled people get accommodated at work, but others don't? It's very confusing when you hear stories about how John got accommodated for his epilepsy, but Jane did not for her anxiety. Both epilepsy and anxiety are disabilities under the ADA, so why would HR treat them different? The reason is that the context behind every accommodation request sometimes matters more than the law. Before you sit down to write your accommodation requests, you need to understand that even though the disability laws are meant to be enforced equally, real life is rarely equal. The letter of the law and the real-world enforcement of the law are two different things. So please pay close attention. The best way to really explain why this matters is with a couple hypothetical examples. For the first one, let's imagine two different people, Kyle and Kelly. Kyle and Kelly both have the same exact disability, a herniated disc in their back. And they request the same exact accommodation, 2 months off of work to recover from surgery. Let's say they both work on the assembly lines at different manufacturing plants. The difference, however, is that Kelly has been with her company for 15 years, whereas Kyle has only been at his company for 5 months. Also, Kelly's employer has thousands of employees, whereas Kyle's only has 5 employees. In this circumstance, I can persuasively argue that the company should grant those accommodations, that these two individuals are legally entitled to have their accommodation requests granted. It seems reasonable, right? However, you and I both know that due to Kelly's 15 years of loyal service at her company, there's a stronger inherent sense of obligation for the employer to accommodate her. Every human intuitively knows that. Additionally, due to the number of employees at Kelly's company, it would be much easier, less burdensome for her employer to temporarily put somebody into her spot on the line while she is on a leave of absence. It would not cause an undue hardship to do that. On the other hand, it might be an undue burden for Kyle's company due to their limited manpower. This is what I mean when I say context matters. The second hypothetical, I think, is even better to illustrate this point. Let's pretend that Matt and Mary work at the same company and they were both hired at the same time. Let's say they both have the same job. They're both inside sales reps. And they both request the same accommodation to temporarily work from home for the next 3 months. The difference here is that Matt broke his leg, whereas Mary was diagnosed with depression. Matt can't walk, Mary is having a mental impairment. The disabilities here are different. Matt has a physical impairment, Mary has a mental one. In this circumstance, again, under the ADA, I can argue till I'm blue in the face that both of these individuals are legally entitled to have their accommodation request granted. However, it would be foolish to think that these two situations will always be treated the same by HR or by the legal system. Because let's be honest, in the real world, a lot of people either fake depression or grossly exaggerate it and make it out to be worse than it really is. But it's pretty hard to fake a broken leg, especially when you have a cast. Right? From HR or from a jury's perspective for that matter, there's an open-ended question regarding factual certainty with Mary. Moreover, it's highly likely that Matt will heal up and return to work with the same level of productivity as before. We honestly can't say that with the same degree of confidence regarding Mary. In the real world, in these two cases, if these two cases went to court, a jury of 12 random people are going to decide Matt and Mary's fate. All else being equal, who do you think is more likely to win? Now, if you're truly understanding what I'm saying, I'm not saying that Mary can't win or that her accommodation request will be denied. Nor am I saying that depression is not a disability or that you shouldn't bring a case if you're in Mary's position and you have a mental impairment. What I'm saying is that the context behind your disability matters. And if possible, you should adapt to the situation that you find yourself in. Well, what do I mean by that? There are 3 really big takeaways. Number 1, adapting may mean that you need to work with your doctor to find a different accommodation than the one that you would preferably like because you think it's more likely to be received well by HR or it's more likely to be seen as reasonable by a jury. Adapting might mean you need to play some politics at work to get your accommodation request granted. Adapting might mean that your lawyer's going to negotiate a little bit differently due to the inherent strength and the context behind the case. Number 2, this context issue is why you can't take a YouTube video as legal advice, or a website for that matter. The practice of law is not a science. It is not black and white. If you have an issue and you need legal advice, you need to call a lawyer in your state. I'm in California. If you worked in California and you were fired because of an accommodation issue, you can call my office and get our opinion on the matter for free. It's a free consultation. 3, my main message here really is this. You need to familiarize yourself with the basic laws that protect you and the context that matters most in these types of situations. And there really is no excuse in today's world, right? At a minimum, you should watch the first 3 videos in this video series so that you understand what is protected by the ADA and what is not. My videos, if you've been paying attention, you know they don't just explain what the law is, they dive deep into the context and explain why things matter. I've got links to all the videos and other helpful websites in the description below. Look, making a small amount of effort here to learn the basics will dramatically increase your chances of success. If you blow the learning part off, you might ruin your accommodation and you might ruin your ability to hold the employer accountable in a court of law. Now, I could talk for hours on this subject, but I think I've covered enough today. The next and final video in our series is all about money. I'm going to reveal how much money reasonable accommodation cases are worth and how lawyers value them. I'm going to dive deep into the damages you could win if your employer fires you and breaks the law. If you found this video to be helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you know somebody who should also learn this information, hit the share button and send this video to them. That's all I have for you today. Take care.
Thank you.